Late at night, with only his closest confidants in the room, King Charles quietly signed a royal order that would permanently sever Camilla's family from the royal residences they had long considered their own. No one anticipated it, least of all Camilla. The move was executed in total secrecy, with the kind of precision normally reserved for matters of national security that could not risk a single leak until the signature was sealed. The halls of Buckingham Palace were hushed, but the weight of the moment hung in the air like a shadow pressing against the walls themselves. The document was short, almost deceptively so, but its consequences were enormous. With just a few lines of ink, every housing privilege, every right of residence, every set of keys her family possessed to royal estates was rescinded. From the grandeur of Sandringham to the quiet cottages at Windsor, their access vanished in an instant. No warning, no compromise, no appeals. This was not the result of a fleeting impulse. Hours earlier, King Charles had sat in a tense private council with Princess Anne and Prince William. Those who glimpsed the trio noticed the severity in their expressions. It was not the warmth of family, but the hardened focus of leaders preparing to act. Words like duty, integrity, and accountability reportedly echoed in that room. At the center was an alleged breach of trust, so grave it risked staining the monarchy's image if ignored. For Charles, the choice was personal as much as political. These were his wife's relatives, the people who had stood alongside her for decades. But his oath to the crown demanded something greater than sentiment. It was one of those defining crossroads every monarch fears, protecting the stability of the institution even at the cost of the heart. And Charles knew the cost would be steep, both in public perception and in his own household. When Camilla finally learned of the decree, she was stunned. At first, she struggled to believe it, convinced there had been some mistake. But disbelief soon gave way to fury as the permanence of the act became undeniable. This was no pause or probation. It was exile. A total banishment from the royal spaces her family had treated as their own for years. Her anger was fierce, but behind it lingered a question. Why now? The truth was not rooted in that single day, but in years of small conflicts, private grievances, and growing mistrust. What began as quiet tensions had finally reached their breaking point, and King Charles had drawn the line with a single stroke of his pen. The truth is, this explosive decision didn't begin the night Charles signed the decree. It had roots stretching back years. Hidden beneath the polished surface of royal life were quiet tensions, whispered warnings, and betrayals that the public never glimpsed. For a long time, the friction stayed beneath the surface, dismissed by many as idle rumor. But slowly, quietly, Camilla's family began to treat the royal estates less as borrowed privilege and more as if they were their personal dominion. At first, the signs were barely noticeable. A few too many names added to a guest list. Visits that stretched far longer than originally intended. Little indulgences that could be brushed aside as harmless excess. But as time went on, the behavior escalated. Whispers circulated of private renovations carried out without the king's knowledge, of rooms altered to suit personal taste instead of preserving their historic character. Priceless heirlooms were moved, gardens redesigned, even royal staff diverted to tend private affairs that had nothing to do with duty or crown. These weren't minor breaches of etiquette. They were acts that steadily eroded the dignity of the monarchy. Palace staff, trained to serve with discretion, began to exchange quiet complaints behind closed doors. Veterans who had dedicated their lives to royal service spoke in hushed tones about arrogance, entitlement, and disrespect from people who had gained their influence not by merit, but by proximity. The unrest spread like an unseen crack in marble, subtle at first, then undeniable. And while most kept their silence, one voice rose above the rest. Princess Anne, with her seasoned eye and unwavering instinct, recognized the danger. She had witnessed enough over decades to know when invisible lines were being crossed. In private, she cautioned Charles, Her tone was measured but urgent. She reminded him that the monarchy's strength rested not only on tradition, but on the perception of integrity. Public trust, once damaged, could never be repaired. Charles listened. He always listened. But hesitation gnawed at him. He knew that moving too quickly might protect the crown, but it could also rip apart his marriage. But standing idle was the greater danger. To the outside world, none of this turmoil was visible. On public stages, Charles and Camilla moved in lockstep, smiling for photographers, exchanging pleasantries as though nothing was amiss. Yet to those who studied them closely, the cracks showed, a stiffness in posture, a flicker of tension in their eyes. And in hushed corners, whispers spread. Prince William, always the guardian of the monarchy's future, was losing patience. He had seen enough. Each day of silence, each act of unchecked indulgence, chipped away at the crown's moral weight. This was no longer about minor lapses or occasional excess. It was a sustained pattern, an erosion of discipline, tradition, and loyalty, the very principles upon which the monarchy's legitimacy had stood for centuries. Camilla's family had begun treating them not as sacred obligations, but as inconveniences. Yet, what finally forced Charles's hand wasn't mismanagement or entitlement. It was an incident so deeply personal, so unforgivable, that even he could not look the other way. It happened at Sandringham. What began as a simple winter retreat spiraled into a scandal that would echo in palace corridors for years. One of Camilla's relatives, emboldened by years of unchecked privilege, arranged a gathering that was nothing short of outrageous, opulent, sprawling, and wildly inappropriate for royal grounds. This wasn't a private family supper or modest celebration. It was a spectacle, with guests who had no rightful place anywhere near the sanctity of Sandringham's private quarters. The recklessness was staggering. Between the laughter and the clinking of glasses, an invisible line had been crossed, one that could not be repaired with excuses or apologies. The situation escalated when security officers conducting routine sweeps made a disturbing discovery. Private royal archives, sealed for decades, had been tampered with. Whether out of arrogance, negligence, or something darker, the files had been disturbed. In a monarchy where such documents are guarded with almost sacred devotion, the violation was an unthinkable betrayal. And then came the final blow. As staff combed through the aftermath, they stumbled across something far more intimate. Personal possessions of the late Queen Elizabeth II. Items that should never have been touched, let alone misplaced. In that instant, the line between carelessness and desecration was obliterated, and Charles knew the time for hesitation was over. The objects, kept untouched and in their rightful places since Queen Elizabeth's passing, were now disturbed, carelessly shifted, some even abandoned where they clearly did not belong. To those who still revered her memory, it felt like desecration, and for Charles, who carried the weight of his mother's legacy like a sacred duty, it was an act beyond forgiveness. Accounts from longtime attendants only deepened the outrage. They recalled hearing Camilla's cousin openly mocking royal customs, making sport of the traditions that had defined the monarchy for centuries. It wasn't just rudeness, it was open contempt for the very institution they had been privileged to inhabit. For many within the royal household, that night confirmed what they had long suspected. Certain members of Camilla's circle didn't see themselves as guests of the crown, but as entitled proprietors. Catherine, as ever composed, couldn't let the slight pass. In a calm but piercing exchange, she confronted the cousin. Her words were measured, but her disapproval was unmistakable. Those who witnessed the moment described the room turning cold, the air heavy with tension. The cousin's dismissive smirk in response only magnified the insult. Not long after, Charles's phone rang. The message was urgent, clipped. The kind of call that strips away sleep in an instant. One detail after another poured out. The reckless party, the breached documents, the mishandled heirlooms, the sneering insults. With each word, Charles's resolve hardened. This was no longer about missteps or lapses in judgment. It was a direct affront to the sanctity of the monarchy, committed within his own walls. And before Charles could even act, it was Anne who gave him the final nudge. She did not come with vague complaints or hearsay. She arrived prepared, carrying a dossier months in the making, an exhaustive account of every breach, every abuse of privilege, every quiet violation Camilla's family had committed. Large or small, each incident was a piece of a larger pattern that could no longer be dismissed. Anne's tone was steady, authoritative, but beneath it pulsed something deeper, a fierce devotion to the monarchy as their mother had envisioned it. She invoked the late Queen's relentless dedication to integrity, reminding Charles that the institution must remain above reproach, even within its own household. Her voice only softened when she spoke of their mother's legacy, warning that allowing this behavior to continue would not only taint the present reign, but dishonor the one that came before. Her words carried weight not out of sentiment, but conviction. This wasn't about Camilla's family enjoying a few luxuries. To Anne, it was about the erosion of the very values that had bound the monarchy together for centuries. Every unchecked indulgence chipped away at the foundation she had spent her life protecting. In her eyes, tradition wasn't antiquated. It was the glue keeping the crown intact in a world where public opinion could shift with a single headline. And she was not alone. Quietly, though not at first openly, William's stance aligned with hers. Both understood the peril of letting such behavior fester unchecked, and both were ready to act where Charles had hesitated. Behind closed doors, Anne and William had already spoken candidly about the problem. Their shared resolve forged a quiet but firm alliance. To them, Charles could no longer respond as just a brother or a husband. He had to act as king. And that meant shielding the monarchy's image, even if it meant stepping directly into personal conflict. At one point, Anne had even confronted Camilla herself. The meeting was outwardly polite, but unmistakably tense. Anne, with the authority of both a senior royal and the daughter of Queen Elizabeth, laid out exactly what could no longer be tolerated. Camilla, unaccustomed to such blunt criticism from inside the family, listened in silence, her face unmoved. Nothing was resolved. No compromise was reached. The chill between them lingered long after their words had faded. That left the decision squarely in Charles's hands. He could attempt to keep the peace in his marriage, ignoring the rising unease, or he could act, sending a clear message that the crown came before personal ties. The choice weighed heavily on him, but the evidence spoke louder than sentiment. In the end, Charles chose duty, and the way he chose to enforce it would leave Camilla feeling both publicly diminished and privately cornered. In the warm glow of his Buckingham study, Charles sat at his desk, the decree spread before him. The silence was thick, interrupted only by the steady tick of the mantel clock. Every line of the document had been shaped by months of frustration, formal testimony, and careful legal drafting. Each word was sharpened to withstand challenge. Once his pen touched the page, there would be no reversal. Standing nearby were not just witnesses, but key players in the monarchy's survival. William was present, his expression calm but unwavering, silently endorsing his father's choice. Anne stood opposite, her eyes locked on Charles, her earlier warnings echoing in the stillness. On either side of the desk, two senior royal solicitors waited, their presence ensuring that this decree would stand against any attempt to undo it, including by Camilla herself. The language was unambiguous. Effective immediately, every residential right granted to Camilla's relatives, permanent homes, seasonal retreats, even short-term stays, was revoked. With one signature, the privileges they had treated as entitlements were erased, and the balance of power within the royal household shifted forever. The decree went further than anyone expected. It revoked every key, every tenancy right, and every form of access to royal residences. Its language was clear, absolute, and impossible to reinterpret. This wasn't simply an eviction. It was a deliberate act of separation, a statement that only the crown decides who may live within its walls. When Charles finally signed the order, his hand shook, not with hesitation but with the weight of the choice. These were his wife's relatives, people he had welcomed into the most private sanctuaries of royal life, shared meals with, laughed with. And yet, his duty to the monarchy demanded this sacrifice. The scratch of the pen across the parchment sealed their fate, a decision that would ripple far beyond palace grounds. Almost immediately, Charles turned to the head of security and gave instructions in low, measured tones. Locks were to be replaced, passes canceled, belongings quietly removed. There would be no dramatic scene, no public confrontation, but the message would be unmistakable. The privilege they had enjoyed was gone. For Charles, the burden of kingship had never felt heavier. He had chosen loyalty to the crown over loyalty to his marriage, stability over harmony at home, and in the back of his mind, he knew this decision would alter his relationship with Camilla forever, turning a partnership into something more brittle, marked by quiet resentment. This was not just a legal directive. It was a declaration. The monarchy would not bend, not even for the queen consort's family. And with its binding clauses locked in, there was no path for Camilla to undo it, not through influence, appeal, or sympathy. What the crown had written into law, only the crown could erase. But the walls of Buckingham Palace could not contain the news for long. Word spread quickly, first among staff and courtiers, then beyond the palace gates. And when Camilla learned of the decree, she did not view it as royal procedure. She saw it as betrayal, not from enemies in the press or political adversaries, but from her own husband. The shock was quickly consumed by fury. To her, this was not about preserving the monarchy. It was about being humiliated. By nightfall, she was determined to confront Charles. At Clarence House, their clash unfolded behind closed doors. Those who overheard would later describe it as unlike anything they had witnessed before. Raised voices cutting through the halls, the calm composure of the royal couple shattered. Camilla demanded answers, insisting she had been blindsided, that her family had been treated like intruders rather than trusted kin. For her, it was not just a decree, it was a betrayal that demanded reckoning. Charles, steady in his tone, made it clear he would not undo what had been done. He spoke of responsibility, of honor, of the monarchy's need to remain unsullied. To Camilla, these sounded like polished excuses, words that disguised the reality that he had chosen the crown over his marriage. When she realized there would be no compromise, she turned inward, rallying her own allies. Behind closed doors, Camilla gathered her family. To them, this was not just the loss of privilege, it was an affront, a dismissal of the legitimacy they thought had long been secured. Their meeting was sharp, pragmatic, and deliberate. They knew the decree itself could not be reversed, but what they could do was seize control of the narrative beyond palace gates. Soon, whispers began reaching carefully selected journalists. Stories were spun portraying Camilla not as grasping or entitled, but as a woman betrayed, loyal to her husband, only to be cast aside in return. The timing of these leaks was no accident, surfacing just as public focus remained fixed on the scandal. For a moment, the tide of opinion wavered. Some in the press painted Camilla as a wronged partner. But inside the palace, the consequences were immediate. The once fluid cooperation between Charles's advisors and Camilla's circle fractured. Staff who had worked easily across both sides now moved cautiously, aware that aligning too openly with one faction might mark them in the other's eyes. The appearance of unity at the heart of the monarchy had been broken, replaced with a quiet but undeniable divide. William and Anne, however, were neither surprised nor shaken. They had foreseen Camilla's counterpunch and closed ranks around Charles without hesitation. In private, they reassured him that this was necessary, that the monarchy's long-term credibility outweighed temporary backlash. In public, they stayed composed, refusing to indulge in the drama, their steady presence silently reinforcing his decision. But outside the palace, the reaction took on a life of its own. Headlines erupted, social media seethed, and the country itself seemed to take sides. By the next day, polling revealed a decisive verdict. Nearly 3/4 of the public stood firmly with Charles. To them, his decree wasn't cruelty, it was leadership. It was the crown reclaiming its dignity after years of indulgence, and a long overdue show of strength against personal excess. The message could not have been clearer. Charles had chosen to act as king first and husband second, and for many, that was exactly what the monarchy needed. Loyalists wasted no time voicing their approval. From local halls to live radio shows, supporters hailed the decree as a decisive act of leadership. Some praised Charles for re-establishing boundaries that had blurred in recent years, seeing it as a long overdue correction. Others, with emotion in their voices, called it a continuation of Queen Elizabeth's vision, a reminder that the crown was never meant to bend for personal convenience. Words like duty, honor, and integrity echoed through their statements, framing the decision as both principled and necessary. But not everyone was applauding. Camilla's allies, both at home and abroad, condemned the move as nothing short of humiliation. They described it as a betrayal, arguing that it weakened not just her role, but the stability of the royal marriage itself. Some critics went further, accusing William and Anne of manipulating the king from behind the scenes. Their sharp rhetoric was calculated, crafted to sow doubts about unity at the heart of the monarchy. The media seized the opportunity. Reporters began dredging up Camilla's family history, old disputes, past scandals, questionable associations long forgotten were suddenly splashed across front pages. Each new headline chipped away at the sympathy her camp had tried to rally. Abroad, the story spread just as fiercely. Commentators framed it as Charles's boldest move since taking the throne, a deliberate gamble to reinforce his authority and prove he would not be ruled by personal attachments. Some admired it as a power play reminiscent of monarchs from centuries past. Others cautioned it might fracture the family in ways that could never fully heal. Under the glare of international scrutiny, Buckingham Palace finally issued a statement. It was brief, precise, and unapologetic. The decree, it said, was in the crown's best interest and would stand. No explanations, no compromises, no room for debate. The tone was firm by design, signaling that, at least in the palace's eyes, the matter was closed. But anyone who thought the fight was finished underestimated Camilla. For her, this was not the end. It was the beginning of a battle she had no intention of losing. Behind the heavy doors of Charles's study, husband and wife no longer faced each other as partners, but as rivals locked in a battle for power. The air was tight, charged with weeks of mounting strain. Camilla came with one aim only, to have the decree overturned. She dispensed with courtesy, her words as sharp as her tone. This, she declared, was more than an insult to her family. It was a direct assault on her position as queen consort. She demanded an immediate reversal, without conditions or delay. Charles listened quietly, but his silence carried no trace of doubt. It was the silence of a man who had already chosen his course. When he finally answered, his voice was firm, deliberate, and final. The decree would stand. There would be no revisions tucked into the margins, no concessions made in secret. He spoke not as a husband, but as a king, his words weighted with the authority of the crown. Camilla's reply cut deep, her anger sharpened by frustrations long left unspoken. Accusations tumbled forth, memories of sacrifices she had made, moments when she had defended him against criticism, the loyalty she had given without question. Now, she said, that loyalty had been repaid with cold detachment. Charles did not remain silent. He answered with grievances of his own, wounds long buried under layers of duty and restraint. Years of unspoken tension spilled into the room, each word widening the rift between them. It was not a dramatic rupture, not a slammed door or shouted threat, but something more devastating, a quiet recognition that the trust between them had been broken beyond repair. They could still share stages, still stand together before cameras, still play the part of unity. But behind closed doors, the fracture was permanent. Charles ended the exchange with resolve, not fury. He reminded her that the crown was bigger than either of them, larger than marriage, larger than family loyalties. His oath was to the institution, not the comfort of those closest to him. To him, this was not cruelty. It was the cost of protecting the monarchy. When their confrontation ended, there was no resolution, only silence, thick with the recognition that something between them had shifted irreversibly. Camilla walked out without a word, and Charles did not stop her. Both knew, without saying it, that the decision had cost them far more than they had imagined. But even after that final clash, a deeper shadow lingered. Locked inside the king's desk was another royal document, one the public knew nothing about. Hidden within the decree was a clause so discreet, so carefully woven into formal language, that only a select few inside the palace knew it existed. On the surface, the order was about removing Camilla's family from royal residences. But behind that straightforward veneer was a safeguard aimed at the future of the crown itself. Written to appear like routine procedure, the provision quietly fortified the path of succession, ensuring William, George, and Charlotte would inherit a monarchy free from outside interference. The clause imposed new restrictions that went far beyond housing rights. It barred Camilla's extended family from gaining influence over royal trusts, charities, or ceremonial appointments. No one outside the direct line could hold authority over the crown's assets or legacy. It was a tightening of control, consolidating the monarchy's most sensitive powers in the hands of the heirs alone. For Charles, it wasn't just about reining in overreach, it was about safeguarding the dynasty's continuity. Inside the palace, speculation swirled. Some believed the clause had been drafted after advisors warned that if Charles's health declined, unchecked influence from outsiders could complicate William's succession. Others whispered that it was William himself who insisted on the measure, making his support for the housing decree conditional on securing the crown's future stability. Either way, the result was the same. George and Charlotte's inheritance, both symbolic and material, would remain untouched by competing loyalties. Princess Anne's discreet approval proved critical. Without her backing, the provision might have been watered down or removed. But Anne, ever disciplined and precise, viewed it as a safeguard, not an attack. Her quiet endorsement gave the amendment weight no one dared challenge. Still, those who grasped its significance understood the risks. Evicting Camilla's relatives from housing was one matter. Cutting off avenues of power and influence was another. If the hidden clause ever became public, it could spark outrage, not just from Camilla's camp, but from those who saw it as a consolidation of authority into too few hands. The potential for deeper divisions was undeniable. And yet the machinery was already in motion. This was not an ending, it was a beginning. If Charles was willing to bury such a clause here, what else might he sign in the months ahead? For close watchers, it appeared the king was just getting started, tightening the crown's defenses one quiet signature at a time. In the end, it was never simply about housing. It was about the monarchy's future, and how far Charles was willing to go to protect it.